Hi quilters! This is the 16th video in our series of videos designed to use leftover 2.5-inch strips or jelly rolls. This is the box I'm most anxious to use up. It contains all the smallest bits and pieces left over from all my other projects. I'm going to make a variation on the jelly roll race style of quilt. So the first thing I need to do is to sew all these pieces end to end. Now I know I don't need everything that's in the box, but I want to use this box up, so I'm going to sew through the entire box. The best way to tackle a project like this is to break it into smaller portions. The sewing for this project took place over the course of a few months. Every time I had a spare 15 to 30 minutes or whatever length of time I wanted, I would just sit down and sew until that time was up. When I wanted to really get some sewing done, I'd set a timer for 60 minutes and sew until the timer went off. When I'm sewing on a project like this, I'll often listen to a podcast, watch a TV show, or listen to a book on tape. What I really love about this kind of sewing is that it's really good for when you want to sew but not think about it too hard. The idea is to just pick up the first piece you touch and sew it to the next piece. I paid zero attention to what I was picking up and sewing together. Several times I sewed the same fabrics together. I really just grabbed whatever was next and started sewing. I had every style and color of fabric in this box. As I went along, I made sure to trim off the selvages. I kept sewing pieces together until the length was about 5 to 6 yards long. And then I'd start a new section and just keep repeating that process. For this project, I really liked the idea of not paying any attention to color and just sewing all the different colors of fabric together. If I do anything like this again in the future, there are a few things I might do differently. For example, I might just sew only one color, so find all the green pieces and sew those together into one long strip. Find all the blue pieces and sew those all together in one long strip, and not mix up the colors. Or I would pick out my focus fabric first, and then only pull pieces that match the fabric that I've chosen. For example, if I pick Christmas print for my main fabric, I would just pick Christmas prints and reds and greens. It was really fun to watch the level of fabric in the box go down as I was using up the strips. While I was sorting out the pieces that I was going to sew, I set aside any squares, triangles, 4 patches, or 4-patch pieces that I found. Getting down to the bottom of the box was a really good feeling. Sewing together the last few pieces was a lot of fun. I didn't keep track of how much time I spent sewing all these pieces end to end, but I did weigh the box before I started sewing. I had 9.5 pounds of bits and pieces of fabric to use in this project. I know that I won't use all of it for this project, but I will have it ready to go for a future project. Once all the sewing is done, it's time to press. And look at that, an empty strip bucket. As I was pressing, I would usually work on 2 lengths at the same time. And to make it easy, I just pressed all the seams in one direction. You could also press them open if you prefer. As I was pressing, I decided the best way to keep these nice and tidy and easy to handle would be to roll them onto some tubes. These tubes are actually leftovers from spools of elastic. I can fit 2 of these strip sets onto one spool. I just tape the end onto the spool and then just start rolling the fabric on as I go. I press for a while and then I'll roll it onto the tube, and then I'll press a little more and just keep going until the tube is all full of fabric. You wouldn't necessarily have to have one of these spools to do this. You could wrap it around a cardboard tube or a gift wrapping tube or a paper towel tube. It took me about a week to get everything pressed and rolled onto the tubes. From that one box of fabric, I ended up with enough pieces sewn end to end to make 9 tubes of fabric. It's amazing how much less space the fabric takes up when it's all sewn together and rolled onto a tube. After I get done with this project, I might take some time to start rolls of colors, so a red, a yellow, a blue, a green, just so I have ongoing strips rolled onto tubes. I also took the time to press all of the squares I found and sort them by color and put them into my color boxes of squares. I also made all of the 4 patches out of the pieces that I found and sewed the triangles together and got all of those pressed too. Now it's time to start working on the project. I put my fabric onto a dowel so that I could spool it off of there a little at a time and it wouldn't get tangled. I'm just going to start sewing the strips together so that I have 2 rows sewn together. I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew the rows together. I'm going to use this entire spool and see how long of a piece that I can get. More mindless sewing coming my way. I love this kind of project. The quilt I'm making today is going to measure 60 inches by 80.5 inches. I'm going to combine 60-inch long pieces of the leftover strips with 6.5-inch wide bands of a solid or solid-looking fabric to make the quilt top. The wide bands of a solid fabric will make space for your eye to rest as you look at the quilt top and give you opportunities to personalize the quilt. I just kept sewing until I ran out of fabric on one of the pieces, and then I cut it off to match the shorter piece. We have an idea page for this quilt located in the Files section of our Facebook group called The Quilted Forest Friends. You can download it and print it at home. Now that I've used up this whole spool of fabric, I'm going to take the tape off the ends and sew until the very end of the shorter strip and cut off the longer strip. I can sew that onto the beginning of a different set of strips. Once you're done sewing the pieces together, it's time to head to the ironing board to press. Press the seams to one side. I usually press it flat first and then open it up and press it away from me. I sewed and pressed 2 of my spools of fabric, and then I decided I needed to do some cutting before I could move on to any more sewing because I thought I might have enough with just those 2. Now I needed to cut sections that were 60 inches long. You can cut one section at a time, one 60-inch long section at a time, or you can cut from both ends so that you may cut multiple layers at once. Since I don't have a cutting table that's 2 yards long, what I did was line up my ends, pin them together, and then I measured the part that was hanging off the side of the cutting table with a measuring tape to find my 60-inch mark. I just made sure to smooth out the fabric as I went along and try to keep it as straight as I possibly could. For this quilt, you will need a total of 14 sets of 2 rows sewn together. Once I got to this stage where I was cutting these into the 60-inch strips, the quilt started to come together much quicker. Any leftover pieces that I had could be sewn onto the ends of other strip sets, so there was very little waste with this project. Once I had my 14 sets of 2 rows made, it was time to pick out the fabric I could use for the 6.5-inch wide bands. You will need 1 2/3 yard of whatever fabric you pick. This fabric will be for both the 6.5-inch bands and for the binding. For this version, we thought a solid fabric was better than a busy fabric. I tried out a black fabric, a gray fabric, green, brown, white, and beige. What I finally decided to go with was the green color. So that we don't have to do as much piecing, we're going to cut along the lengthwise grain instead of selvage to selvage. Cut off the selvage edge first, and then cut 4 sections that are 6.5 inches wide. It was right about here when I discovered this rotary blade was really dull and I was probably cutting through too many layers. I found a rotary cutter with a sharper blade and then took it a little bit slower so that I could easily get through all of the layers. After you've cut the 4 sections that are 6.5 inches wide, cut the remainder of the fabric into sections that are 2.5 inches wide. These will be used for your binding. To cut the binding, I opened it up so I would have fewer layers to cut through. I picked this plainer fabric for my band and binding fabric because I wanted it to calm down the strips, because the strips are kind of wild and crazy. But if you picked your band fabric first, you could pick your strip fabrics and sew them end to end together to coordinate with your band fabric. For example, if you picked a Christmas print to be your band fabric and your binding fabric, you could pick reds and greens to be your strips and then only use those two colors for the rest of the quilt. There are so many options to personalize this idea depending on the types of scraps and prints that you have. Don't be afraid to cut up your stash into 2.5 inch wide strips and make your own scraps. Now that everything is cut, all we have left to do is a bunch of sewing. Put aside 2 of the sets of 2. Make 6 units that are 4 rows across. I highly recommend pinning before sewing. I will usually pin both ends together and then find the center and pin that together and then kind of ease as I go. Stay all the way to the end of the video to see a second quilt I made using the same idea and to get an update on the strip buckets. Once you're done sewing, you can press the seam open or to one side. Once you have made your 6 sets of 4 rows, set 2 of those rows aside. Then you will need to make 2 sets of 6 rows and 1 set of 8 rows. Make sure you remember the important step of pinning before you sew. One of the things I like most about making scrap projects is remembering what the scraps came from, what project I was working on that made these scraps. It's always fun to remember the quilts from the past. Now for some quilter math. On this quilt, I had 28 rows that were all 60 inches long. Once you factor in the 1/4 inch seams that I needed to sew all the strips together, that's over 1,700 inches of fabric. Then you have to divide that number by 36 inches, which is the number of inches in a yard. That's around 47 yards of length needed to make the quilt, which means I sewed enough little tiny pieces of fabric together to equal about half the length of a football field. And I made 2 quilts, so I used a football field's length of fabric in little tiny pieces to make 2 quilts. And those are some quilt math numbers I love. Once all the sections are made that have the strips in them, it's time to start sewing all the pieces together. The 6.5 inch wide bands of solid color will go between the sets of 4, 6, and 8 rows of strips. The 4 row wide sections will go on each end of the quilt top. The 8-row wide section will be in the middle, and the sections of 6 rows will go in between. Once finished, I picked a single fabric for the backing and put it on my long arm quilting machine to get it machine quilted. In the sections where the strips are, I used a beige colored thread and did a stipple design so it would kind of blend in with all of the different fabrics. In the 6.5-inch wide bands of green, I quilted it in a straight line in a thread that matched the green. The backing is just a floral green that I picked because it matched the binding. I made a second quilt using this idea, but instead of buying a solid fabric for the 6.5-inch wide bands, I pieced purple strips together to separate the rows of strip scraps. I found a spool of all purple scraps that had been sewn together end to end and decided to give piecing the wide band of a single color a try. Yes, it was some extra cutting and piecing, but in the end, I think it was worth it because I got to use even more scraps. For this quilt, the horizontal rows are now separated by vertical strips cut 6.5 inches wide. Using all the shades of a single color for the 6.5-inch wide band really helps it stand out. If you want to use even more of your scraps, this might be a method for you to try out. For this one, I quilted it on my long arm quilting machine using a single thread color and just quilted it in an all-over design of big loops. I picked a really busy design for the back fabric so that the quilting would hide, and the binding was a piece I had found in my bucket that was already long enough to use for the binding. I started with 9 spools of strips plus the one purple one I found, and I ended up with 7. At the very beginning, I told you my box was 9.5 pounds. The strips now weigh 6.5 pounds, which means I used 3 pounds of fabric to make my quilt tops. Since the last quilt I made for the strip videos, I've only added a few strips to my strip bucket. And now, since these strips are all sewn together and nice and tidy on these spools, they take up a lot less space. So I was able to fit them on top of my other fabrics in my bucket, and I'm officially down to 1 bucket of fabric. And boy, does that feel good. But don't fear, there's more videos coming, so keep on watching. We hope you'll remember to hit the like button, leave a comment for us, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!